学术前沿，思想对话，欢迎走进世纪大讲堂。今天我们来到了香港城市大学，和我们在座的老师和同学们一起来和我们的两位嘉宾对话经济与金融的问题。首先，允许我介绍两位嘉宾，来自美国的诺贝尔经济学奖得主、美国斯坦福大学麦伦舒尔斯教授，以及香港城市大学商学院经济与金融系王景东教授和我们一起对话。首先，感谢二位。
麦伦舒尔斯，美国著名经济学家，斯坦福大学教授，诺贝尔经济学奖得主。他与费雪布莱克共同提出了著名的期权定价公式布莱克舒尔斯模型。该模型提供给人们计算金融衍生产品的基本概念，并已成为全球金融市场的标准模型。1997年，麦伦舒尔斯和罗伯特莫顿凭借该模型获得诺贝尔经济学奖。王景东，香港城市大学商学院经济与金融系教授。王教授致力于研究多种市场的价格形成机制，股票、债券、房产、外汇市场等。他对美国国债一级市场的研究，在学术界和政策面都具有一定的影响。
Nice to meet you, Professor Schulz. 王教授您好，非常荣幸和各位在一起探讨这个金融方面的话题。那么，先问一个问题给王教授啊，因为现在像美国主导的这种 TTP、TTIP 这样的一个构架，如果真正完成的话，会对全球经济出现一个怎样的波动？有人说它是对中国的一种围堵，您怎么看这个观点？
这个事情是这样的啊，我觉得呢，就是 TPP， 就是先简单介绍一下，是英文的缩写，就是 Trans-Pacific Partnership。这个历史来源是2005年，就是说4个环太平洋小国吧，是文莱、新加坡、新西兰还有智利。他们呢就是说希望促进一个比一般的贸易协定更加自由化的这么一种深度的合作吧。那么这个协议的话，最初就这几个创始国之间的一个贸易方面的、经济方面的合作计划了，应该说伙伴关系计划，对吧？大约在2008年，就是奥巴马做了美国总统之后呢，就大幅的加速了。美国呢正式大约09年开始就谈判，就参加这个 TPP 的谈判，也邀请了其他的一些国家，包括澳大利亚等等。那么中国对这个 TPP 是怎么样一种态度呢？我觉得中国是持开放的态度。其实，在习主席就是说半年前就访美的时候，那个 TPP 这个议题是提出来的。据那个美国的总统的助理说，这个在私下他们在那个加州就见面的时候，这个是私下谈话的议题，没有作为公布的那个联合声明当中的一部分。但是中国是持开放态度。
那目前我们是主动还是被动的状态？
我们是观战，我觉得。因为呢，加入的话有一些技术性的困难，就刚才说了，这个比一般的关贸协定还要全面，还要资金跟人员的流动。我们的下面会谈到，就是说人民币的可转换问题然后利率改革等等，这些步子都还要迈出所以说这个阶段，我觉得加入 TPP 是可能不成熟的，但是我们没有持拒之于门外，就是说从原则上不接受这么一种态度，这不是我理解的官方态度。
现在这个华尔街有这样的声音说，中国的房地产泡沫是迪拜的1000倍，甚至比这个更糟。您觉得这样的一种唱空中国的说法，在您的观点当中是怎么样看待的？
The famed short seller Jim Chanos said that China is on the treadmill to a disaster, and in particular the real estate sector is probably a Dubai 1,000 times over. What's your take on this?
Well, the interesting question is to ask if you look at income growth in the big cities such as Beijing and in Shanghai, it's been about 13% a year now for many years, which is not far different from the 14% increase per year in prices in these cities. Partially with the advent of markets, especially the stock markets, and not being able to grow as dramatically in terms of new investments in that many people have decided that real estate is a better investment than the alternative of the stock markets, which haven't been transparent. And also, obviously, the Shanghai markets and others, Shanghai markets have contained a disproportionate amount of state-owned enterprises and not as many small, medium enterprises, which have not been listing in the last number of years. If you look at the United States stock market, Apple Computer, which was nothing in 2000, is close to or at the largest market cap. And if you look at Google, it didn't really exist in 2000. If you look at Facebook, it didn't exist in 2000 and wasn't listed, and Twitter, etc. So if you're not going to allow for high-tech companies to list and grow in China, then the alternative of investing in only state-owned enterprises where the transparency and the governance, etc., are not as good, means that you would tend to have people move from that to other investment channels which they can understand more readily than the market. Now, the second-tier cities, basically with the liberal credit expansion that had occurred through the shadow banking system, it might have been the case that developers and the like had been able to borrow through the wealth management products more readily than obviously they could prior to that. And I think if you look at recent policies, you've noticed that as credit expansion has occurred, then real estate prices tend to go up. But now that the curtailing of the wealth management products and the shadow banking system, in addition to the liberalization of interest rates that the banks can charge for loans, has curtailed the growth of real estate prices in some of the secondary cities. But you have to understand the following about China and the world. That in 1910, about 10% of the world's population lived in cities. By 2008, 50% of the world's population lived in cities. It's the most productive way in which people will live. There are, in the next 40 to 50 years, I think we'll see a growth rate of population in cities going to 75% of the world's population will live in cities. And the reason that, as I said, because it's the most productive. So if we're going to see the world's population moving to cities, that means that we will see in China a tremendous movement of 700 million people to cities. Not 700 million, but a large fraction of the 700 million will move to cities. The policy that I convinced that the Plenum will come out with will actually give property rights to peasants and people in the countryside and allow them to transfer property and to borrow against property, which will increase the wealth of China quite dramatically. As a result of that, it will enable people to move to cities and combine with the rights of hukou and being able to be citizens of Shanghai, regardless if you were born in Shanghai or moved to Shanghai, means that we'll see a great development of the middle class through more services and more city living. So as a result of that, in Western countries, we have 4 megacities, which are London, Paris, Los Angeles, and New York. And in the next 20 years or so, I think of the 25 megacities, probably about 16 or 17 of them will be in China.
You really think so?
Pardon me? Yes.
So urbanization is going to be underpinning
huge amount of growth. Yeah. So the question is whether you have current policies in which prices are too high in certain regional things, or whether it's the case that China's growth will stop and you'll get back to where you were. But if the current trajectory remains in force, there's going to be a tremendous demand for cities. Now, I think that the most important thing is these cities are sustainable. I mean, we can't have people moving to cities without good air, good education, good medical facilities, good transportation, good interactions and services within the city. So the greatest growth is going to figure out ways to make our lives, the greatest growth areas in terms of new invention, new technology, is to be able to understand how we can leapfrog our current ways of doing things and build sustainable cities. And that's going to be a great growth area, in my view, in the next number of years, or next 20 years or 30 years.
Wonderful.
好，非常感谢二位的解答。那么接下来我们有请 Professor Schultz 给我们带来他今天的演讲，掌声欢迎。
不同于有效市场模型与完全非理性模型，麦伦·舒尔斯提出了限制条件模型。什么是限制条件模型？金融市场上有哪3种赚钱的方法？而理性的投资者是如何能够在转移风险的同时又赚到钱？世纪大讲堂特别节目，我们的金融思考，对话诺贝尔经济学奖得主下正在播出。
So I've been working on a paper lately. Actually, it's in SSRN, just put in there a couple of weeks ago, which is sort of a third view, okay, in terms of the efficient market model, a la Fama, or the completely irrational market, a la Schiller, in terms of how prices are affected in markets. And it's I call it the constraints model, the market for constraints, okay, that the world really works where you don't optimize things without constraints and in the market. And I always think of investments as an elephant, okay? Investments to me is the elephant. There's 3 ways in which we make money in the markets, okay? One way is riding the elephant. So the elephant bounces up and down, it carries us forward. That's what we call in finance factor returns, making money because of factors or so-called beta. That was under the Sharpe models, where we had Sharpe equilibrium models, which said, and it developed the whole industry of index funds or ETFs or passive investment. And I was very heavily involved in that in the late 60s, early 70s, developing the idea of passive investments with Wells Fargo Bank that later became a very large part of the investment community. The idea that you can ride the elephant, and then you can make competitive returns, but that's competitive. You're just making the risk premium. The elephant goes somewhere. You ride what the elephant does, and generally, if the elephant goes from A to B, eventually you're going to make competitive returns. So that's one way to make money. Now, the other way to make money is trying to figure out where the elephant's going to go. Okay. Now, basically, you're in front of the elephant, and you are trying to figure out where it's going to go, and that's called alpha, or abnormal returns in the market. Trying to be an analyst, you try to estimate cash flows, you try to do it better than everyone else can do it in the market. You think about this stock being cheap, or that stock being rich, or this investment project being rich, or that investment project being cheap in the marketplace. So that's and Schiller would say, because of irrational behavior in people, or Mr. Chanos, or whatever, as you described before, that basically the prices are completely out of line. You just have to pick the ones that are cheap, and it'll go up, or to sell the ones that are rich. So he can forecast when the markets are irrationally exuberant or whatever. So these are all forecasters. Now, Fama would say, that's impossible. You can't forecast where the elephant's going to go. And the elephant will do what it wants to do, and you can't forecast it, and the like. And I tend to agree with that in the very short run, if you just try to analyze where everyone else is analyzed, it's going to be very tough to consistently make money. Okay? But everyone likes to think that 90% of the people you would ask say, oh, yeah, I can beat everyone else, and so... but not everyone can beat everyone else. Even you as students know that even though you're the best student in the class, not everyone can be the best student in the class and always be the winner. So it's very competitive and very tough to know where the elephant's going to go. I mean, on the other hand, because of constraints that I'm going to talk about in a moment, if everyone is concentrating on where the elephant's going to go in the short term, and you, as investors, can have the trust of your investors such that you can have less tracking error and take themes that allow you to have huge deviations, because if you know the elephant's going to go into the forest, in about 5 hours, but everyone else is worrying about where the elephant's going to go today in the first little moments, then the elephant might go far away from the forest for the short run, but then you have to have trust among your investors and such that they will enable you to deviate quite considerably from what everyone else is doing. Because if everyone else, it's like the car driving down the road. You know, you're driving down the road and everyone else is going fast. You're going the speed limit and that. So do you say, they have information I don't have, so you go faster as well and turn up over the hill? You know, it's the case that you go down the hill and there's an accident, and that's very tough for everyone to stop, or vice versa. You don't go fast and you get run over. Namely, in the investment world, a lot of your investors leave you if you have what we call tracking error, or deviations from the market benchmarks that are set for you as far as investment is concerned. So the idea of thinking about why it's the case there's constraints, why the tracking error forces investors to be shorter term than you might expect they would be in a different situation, and why, if you had an ability to create trust, that then there's returns to be made in understanding where the elephant's going to go in the future. And now, the other part of the elephant, which is the rear of the elephant, is where most of the animals go. You know, they try to follow the elephant because the dung of the elephant is amazingly rich in nutrients, okay? Amazingly rich in nutrients, because the elephant does not chew its cud or regurgitate its food. So the elephant eats 20 hours a day, you know, chewing the reed and that sort of thing. And basically everyone knows, if they're smart animals, that there's a hell of a lot of nutrients in what is being done because of the partial digestion of the elephant, of the reeds and the grass that it tends to eat. Now, great investors know that that making money is following the elephant. Because why? There's a supply-demand imbalance that occurs because of what others don't understand. They want a risk transfer. They don't understand things. They'll transfer risks and be willing to pay others to take risk from them. And so if you know someone wants to pay you to take the risk, and you have a business which you can understand what these risks are, okay, that's far different from forecasting the future, okay, because all sides of what I said are rational. You know, it's unfortunately the elephant has to eat the reeds and do that, but he, in a sense, continues to do it, or the elephant continues to do it. Now, the interesting part about investment is to think about how money is made by risk transfer and paying someone else to take the risks. I mean, and this goes all over finance. This goes all over economics, is that people are willing to pay others to take risks from them, and it's a rational decision for them to do that. So the interesting example has always been the farmer has a wheat crop, the wheat or rice. The wheat crop comes in, and then they transfer the risk to the miller who stores the wheat. Okay, the miller stores the wheat, so the farmer knows they're giving up money by transferring the risk to the miller who stores the wheat. The miller, in turn, has to decide whether to keep all the wheat in its storage facilities or hedge some of the wheat by transferring some risk to the speculator in the futures market. The miller says, yes, I'll transfer some of the risk to the futures market person. Why? Because for me, it's less costly to transfer inventory risk than to retain inventory risk and have to have a lot of equity capital sitting around to handle the shocks or uncertainties associated with general macro conditions. On the other hand, the miller knows that his expertise is the local market, who's going to buy the wheat, the flour to make the bread and cakes, who's going to buy it? That's his local thing. He knows that market. It's his idiosyncratic skill. So the futures market, or the risk transfer market, allows for a separation of what you know from what you don't know. In other words, you can concentrate on what you know, and you don't have to have a lot of equity capital to handle risks that you don't know about. So this transfer of risk to the speculator occurs, and in turn, when the when the baker comes and buys the flour to make the bread and cakes, then the hedges tend to be lifted because the inventory falls, and then we, the consumers, buy the bread and cakes from the baker. So basically, we, the consumers, know we're paying the baker for his services. The baker, in turn, knows he's paying the the miller for his services, and the farmer in turn knows they're paying the miller for the risk transfer services. So the market, that's an efficient way to organize activities. Maybe in the future we'll be able to contract through our cell phone directly with the farmer and avoid all middlemen, but all business and all automation innovation is trying to reduce the number of people who do all this risk transfer and service parts and make that more efficient in terms of transacting. So the idea of risk transfer in that is each one along the way knew they were paying for something, willing to give up returns, the farmer willing to give up returns because of the risk of storage, and more important, inability to understand that business. That's not their business. Their business is farming, getting the wheat. The miller's business is understanding the local markets, the speculator understanding general markets and how to hedge and take the risks generally in a horizontal way with his other positions, etc. And additionally, the baker knowing how to make cakes, and we knowing how to consume bread and cakes and not knowing much about growing wheat at all. So the transformations that go on in our society are such that that's what I mean by following the elephant is there's a lot of times when things happen that people don't understand. They don't have enough people around to do it. There's concentration and division of labor, so that making money is, if there's concentration in distress, concentration in mergers and arbitrage situation, there are concentrations in housing or knowing what's happening in particular markets, then there's possibility of developing technical skills in which people are willing to pay these intermediaries to carry risk forward in the market and to make money. So basically, the paper that I worked on recently is saying, look, when you have managers, because managers need capital, when managers do these particular activities, the tracking error is going to be larger because they can't stay with the index. If you're buying distressed securities, for example, you have to hold them for a longer period of time than a quarter. For these situations to work out, it might be a year, 2 years, whatever, until things come to fruition and the imbalances are eliminated in the marketplace. Synchronicity occurs maybe quickly. Asynchronicity might be there for longer periods of time, and we need intermediaries to carry these risks forward, and others are willing to pay them to carry them forward.
理性的投资者愿意让出一部分利益，将风险转移给专业的中介机构。可是，该如何监督经理人的表现？在给经理人施加限制条件的情况下，限制条件是否会带来隐性的成本？世纪大讲堂特别节目。我们的金融思考，对话诺贝尔经济学奖得主下正在播出。
So the issue is, how do I know how my managers are doing or what they're doing for me? One way to do it is direct monitoring. You go to talk to them, you get trust in them. It's like getting married. You know, when I had a business, Ross Perot, who ran for president of the United States, his investment group wanted to invest with us, but the only way they would invest with us is have their people come and live at my house for 3 months. Now, I said, I don't want your money. Coming and living at my house for 3 months to know my personality just doesn't make any sense to me. So that's an extreme form of monitoring, okay, and watching. Now, you know, it's the same thing as getting married. You can marry someone quickly, or you can take a long time to get married, or rationally never get married. But the point is, and live in a spot contract where you have to renew it all the time, as opposed to taking a long-term contract where you promise your partner you're going to talk things over, but you never do. So basically, the issue here is one of thinking about hiring a manager to manage money for you. Then you can do direct monitoring, and that's costly. On the other hand, you can do indirect. That's a direct cost or explicit cost. The interesting question is, if you impose constraints on your manager, staying within a benchmark, you can be to the benchmark, whatever the benchmark is, but don't deviate more than X% from the benchmark. And if you deviate more than X% from the benchmark, I won't like it. I'll remove my money from you. Now, that also helps the manager, because the manager might be an expert about knowing about, say, the prices of wheat in the local community or demands, but might not be an expert at all about the general level of inventory. Because money is made turning over inventory and not making money on the level of inventory. So the interesting question is that we impose implicit constraints on our managers to stay within various boundaries. So the question is, if the constraint exists, is there an implicit cost? In other words, if you impose a tracking error constraint on your manager, does that impose an implicit cost in the sense you give up returns? Okay? So you can have, like, for example, when you use your credit card and you buy things, the price in the store is 100, right? But maybe the credit card company gets 2. So if everyone used credit cards in the store, the price of goods would, no one used credit cards in the store, the price of the goods would have been 98. So you can say, I pay 100, so you think that's the price, but then you then have to ask the question, you know, what is the implicit cost, or the 2, for the goods and services that I'm buying using my credit card? So the interesting question we asked is, when you run the models and you impose a tracking error constraint, does that have a cost? And we found, yes, it does. It has you have to buy an inefficient portfolio. If you're a manager who has skills and can forecast the future or analyze the dung of the elephant, that basically you'll have a reward to risk ratio. The greater the reward to risk ratio, then the greater the constraint is on you, because you want to plunge and you can't do it. You have to stick closer to the benchmark. Sticking closer to the benchmark means that you have to buy an inefficient portfolio for the portfolio you want to buy. Interestingly enough, in our work, we find that what is the portfolio you buy? Say you love high-risk stocks, you love middle-risk stocks, and you love low-risk stocks. But and you have to finance the things you love in the high-risk category, the middle-risk category, and the low-risk category. What we find from the mathematics and the analytics is you have to sell low-volatility stocks to finance your love of high-volatility stocks, middle-volatility stocks, and low-volatility stocks. So as a result of selling the low-risk stocks, managers who are active managers are forced by tracking error constraints to overweight higher volatility stocks. So what the behavioralists would say is that the reason higher volatility stocks tend to be overbid in the market or overvalued is because of lotteries. People like risk. They'll pay for risk. And so these individuals will pay for risk. In our model, we show that sophisticated, rational investors would also overbid higher volatility stocks. Behavioralists have one view. Schiller Group and that have one view of why people would overpay. And Fama would say that's a risk factor. The fact that higher volatility stocks earn less than lower volatility stocks is a risk factor. All the efficient market people talk about risk factors as explaining anomalies in markets, okay? And then all behavioralists say, no, it's just irrational. Dogs running all over the place that explains it. And so the models and thing I've been working on are some of these models of constraints. What are the constraints that investors have? They know they're giving up returns, but the constraints are less costly on them than are explicit costs associated with taking actions if we bring people into the investment world. So in my world, active investment managers have to hold higher risk stocks in their portfolio, more so than they want to hold in an unconstrained world. And we test this model on mutual fund data of active managers in the United States, and we find that relative to the S&P 500 benchmark, they do overweight higher volatility stocks. In fact, by 8 to 10% on average between 2000 and 2013, when the data set ended. And not only that, but they outperform in this high vol selection, they outperform in the middle vol selection, and they outperform in the smaller vol selection. These managers outperform a naive strategy of just holding the S&P 500. However, because higher volatility stocks tend to earn less, under the standard capital market models, they tend to give up those returns or some of those returns because the higher volatility stocks tend to underperform relative to others. So here you have a model of equilibrium, which is a constrained model. What's the prices? Then you have to ask, how come when you have an optimization and you have a shadow constraint, you have a constraint, a shadow cost, then if the cost of the constraint is positive, are there other ways to do things? Yes. Over time, other ways are discovered. Maybe with our cell phones in the future, with efficient technology, we'll be able to reduce the cost of monitoring dramatically. As the cost of monitoring decreases, then the constraints we have to impose are decreased as well, because we always trade off explicit versus implicit. Implicit ways to do things are explicit. We're going to have cell phones in the future. We're going to do all our transactions through cell phones. We won't use credit cards in the future. That's stupid. Why carry around the plastic, which has a lot of security things in that? We're going to have new ways of transacting, which is going to reduce these costs. But in the meantime, if you explain investment decisions and returns, you can't ignore the constraints of others in thinking about how that affects equilibrium pricing. And so that's been these anomalies, for example, understanding why the returns are there in the dung of the elephant, why people do not invest in longer-term investments, why they're forced to have tracking error close to others, and how you gain trust with investors so you can reduce or mitigate these costs, I think is an interesting research area where everyone knows that at the current moment they're willing to give up returns because that's the best alternative relative to other direct monitoring costs. So thank you. Appreciate it.
有观点认为，国际贸易中美元的供大于求引发了金融危机，人民币的国际化在未来能否减轻金融危机的压力？中国的金融衍生品市场还处于初级阶段，该如何打造一个健康的金融衍生品市场？世纪大讲堂特别节目，我们的金融思考对话诺贝尔经济学奖得主下正在播出。
Thank you for your speech. The students have some question want to communicate with you. 我们现场有很多城市大学的这个学金融专业的学生，如果你们有问题的话，请举手示意我。来。
Thank you, Dr. Schultz. I'm an MBA student from the City University. Since, as we know, that the celebrated Black-Scholes model and the option theory has played an important role in the spectacular growth of the financial product offerings in the past 40 years. And the market now in China is at a nascent stage, and our product offerings are quite limited. So what I would like to ask is, could you please share some of your insights in relation to the development of a healthy derivative market? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, it was interesting, you know, that that regulators really believe, it's true in the United States, it's true in China, that you want to protect the small investor. Okay, so the interesting issue, as I talked about before in my talk, was who provides liquidity to the markets? Who's the sharks? Who makes things work in the market? You know, and so I really believe that the way you facilitate the growth and development of an efficient, well-functioning, service-oriented derivative market is to reduce the impediments that don't allow for the hedging and the dynamic technology that is needed to really have an options market working or futures market working. And I think that some of the old rules that are in place, for example, the cost of short selling or the inhibition against short selling or the fear of short selling, that is the wrong way to look at it, because you have to look at the benefits that allow intermediaries to step in and hedge the risk and transfer risk, and you want to try to reduce those costs or figure out what the benefits of retaining restrictions are, such as two-day settlement or causing there to be sand in the gears, because the most, such as inhibition of short selling or large cost of short selling in the marketplace. So I think that if you rely on intermediaries, sophisticated traders, to make using technology such as the Black-Scholes model or other technology that they would develop to make the market, provide liquidity for the markets, just the same way as I talked about speculators providing hedging capabilities for the millers in my example, and reduce the restrictions and frictions, then the market will be more efficient, the market will grow, the new products will develop, and risk transfer products will develop that will be very valuable to China. And so I'm hoping that over time, if you have high transaction costs and high frictions, basically it'll make the market less liquid. You know, and that's the interesting issue, because if you have high frictions, you have to use a control mechanism to manage these products and developments. What I mean by a control chart, because the cost of making a transfer is large, you have to let it go up, and then you make an adjustment. So if you get a very wide boundaries, that means the markets could be very inefficient in between. The tighter you can make it, or the less costly restrictions are for intermediaries who can understand these markets, the sharks, so to speak, in doing things, then it's the case that you'll get more products developed, more efficacy, more trust in the markets, and people will use these to handle risks and transfer risk and be able to hedge risks, just as the farmer can rely on the prices in the futures market to decide whether to sell now or hedge now or transfer now to the miller, and the miller in turn can decide whether or not to hedge and think about alternative ways in which can provide efficiently for us to buy the bread and cakes.
Professor Schultz, I'm Jessie, one of the MBA students in City University. My question is about the uncertainty of the internationalization of RMB. I heard some economists stated that the unsymmetrical monetary system of using US dollars as the only world currency during the international trade, this causes the excessive dollar supplies and thus forcing financial crisis. So I'm wondering about that. What do you think about this statement? And according to your expert of the global financial trends, do you think that the internationalization of RMB would release the financial crisis pressure in the future?
I don't know that answer to that because I don't know how the leash is going to break next time. If I knew how the leash was going to break, then I can plan for it. But it's the most interesting thing about crises. Like in the United States, we have rivers, okay, and the rivers flood at particular points. So what we do is we build a dam right at that point to stop the water from flowing there. But then we build a dam, but the river never seems to break at the same point again and flood, And the interesting thing is that all crises are, by definition, unanticipated or unique, and we know they're going to occur. We just don't know how they're going to occur, why they're going to occur, what the pressures that build up. I mean, maybe Mr. Chanos is right that a crisis will occur in China because of the blow-up of real estate markets. But you don't know when a bubble exists. So basically, you don't know bubbles. You don't know when they're going to break, what's going to happen, whether it is a bubble or it isn't a bubble. So the issue of crisis management is it could be that having an RMB trading alongside the dollar would not have as much crises, but the world is interrelated. The idea we have, the world, you can't have isolation. You have a free trade zone in Shanghai, it's not going to be walled off. Sure, it'll be experiments and ways to think about changing things, but the leakage will be phenomenal. And people, that's what economics does. If there's a constraint, they try to figure out ways to alleviate the constraint or change the constraint. So it's the idea is trying to understand, we don't know what really causes a crisis generally, and we don't know what causes a particular crisis. And so it's very hard to answer your question as specifically as you asked it, given the way I think about uncertainty and shocks. But I do think that from the point of view of trade, if you have a lot of volatility in currency, then Chinese firms who are contracting with and interacting with African firms using the dollar as a medium of exchange, that increases volatility. And so if their hedging markets are not efficient or costly to use, and the hedging is not an exact hedge for what you want, then obviously you can reduce uncertainty and reduce the risks of carrying inventory and transferring inventory around the world by trading in the currency that makes sense for what you're doing. And so that'll reduce uncertainty generally. Whether it reduces crises or helps crises, who knows? It might be the case having something blow up in China because of the RMB might cause there to be crisis in the United States if the RMB is used as the medium of exchange.
Okay, the next one.
Good afternoon, Professor Schultz. I'm Lisa, one of the MBA part-time students. I'm in awe of your extraordinary achievements in academic. So could you please share with us what personal qualities do you think that contribute to your successful story? Thank you very much.
You have to be very handsome. Actually, no. No. Be more serious. Okay, about this is that I think you have to have a willingness to. There's a lot of ways to state this. I'm trying to think about what the best way to characterize it. But what it is, you have to have an objective. Okay, you have to really have persistence or a goal, and then you experiment along the way. You do research, experiment, and then things don't work out. But do you learn anything from things not working out, or do you learn something from things working out? But if I've had a lot of colleagues and a lot of students over time, and they have not wanted to take the risks associated with creating something to really have a view and try to think about it in a very persistent way. And I think, I don't know how it happened or whatever, but I've just always been very persistent of what I wanted to do and learn from my trials, learn from things and how to adjust things and have a very positive attitude towards research and trying to create things. And I was also, intuitively, I was very smart because, intuitively I was smart, not necessarily smart otherwise, but in two ways. I think that one way is that you get smarter over time. The more you learn, the smarter you are. So you're not born with a level of intelligence. I really think you keep increasing your intelligence over time by continuing to learn and really learning how to learn and keep doing that. So I think that was valuable. For me, intuitively, I thought that was the case. And second is I was smart enough to say, we're the best people, because I'm going to steal everything I can from them. I'm going to listen to them and steal everything I can from them. If I can steal from them, then I can become smarter, right? So the idea was me to steal as much as I could. So in life, the way you do it is go where the smartest people are and steal from them. But. This is the but. Okay? If you're not as smart as they are, right, then they'll throw you out. So the point is you have to find the right group for you at that stage in your life where you continue to learn. You steal from them, and then they steal from you, and basically if you're not making it anymore where you're growing and learning, then you move on. You steal from somewhere else, okay? And that you keep going up the ladder of getting the team of groups of people that you continue to learn from. And I want to tell you, your level of intelligence is not constant. It continues to grow in your life, and you can make it grow. You can make it constant, but you continue to grow. If you're smart, and I know you're smart because you got into the school and you're good, but you're not smart in a static sense. So that means the way you can grow and increase your intelligence, really grow, is be willing to experiment, be willing to fail, and keep growing and keep learning. And that's what that's what I think has been the key to what I've done.
Very thanks for your answer and your advice. Thank you so much. 最后再一次感谢 Professor Schulz and 我们的王教授，也感谢香港城市大学的同学和老师们。感谢您收看这一期节目，下期再见。